Hey guys, welcome to BudgetEDH. On this week's episode, we bring you Narset, Enlightened Master at a $100 budget. Narset is 3, a blue, a red, and a white for a legendary creature with first strike and hexproof. Whenever she attacks, exile the top 4 cards of your library. Until end of turn, you may cast non-creature cards exile with Narset this turn without paying their mana costs. Narset is a very powerful commander that has built-in protection on her in the form of hexproof. Now we do want to get Narset down as quickly as possible. She is a 6 converted mana cost commander, and in this deck there's not a whole lot of things that we're going to be doing until we get Narset on the battlefield. We are going to be playing a very interaction based game in the very early game. We have a lot of interaction in the form of counterspells and single target removal in this deck. We don't want to lose the game in the first 3 to 5 turns before we even get our ball rolling. And then once we get Narset on the battlefield, we do have some ways in the deck where we're able to give Narset haste. We do want her to be able to attack the first turn that she enters the battlefield. Because of that inherent protection on her of the hexproof, if you pass the turn your opponent's board wipe, it's going to set you so far back. So we do want to get her swinging the first turn you play her. And then once you do play Narset and you are swinging in and getting those triggers where you're able to exile the top 4 cards of your library and play non-creature spells, the way that we're able to continue storming off with Narset is by flipping extra combat and extra turn spells off the top of our library so that we can continue going with Narset. And then you may be asking yourself, how are we going to win with this deck? There's a couple of ways. We can win through combat damage with Narset, and then there's a couple of ways that we're able to add some tokens onto the battlefield to help us with that combat strategy with Narset as well. And we do have a couple of cards that will just win us the game if we are able to cast them a couple of times. We'll go over all those cards near the end of the video. Let's start out this deck tech by talking about all the ways that we're able to ramp in this deck. Since the objective is getting Narset down as quickly as possible, since your deck doesn't really do a whole lot without Narset on the battlefield, we are going to focus heavily on ramp that is 2 converted mana cost or less. We do want to get Narset down quickly so that we can get her down and start swinging in to get some free cast triggers off of her. So first up, we have Wayfarer's Bubble. It's an artifact that you can pay 2 and tap it and sacrifice it. You search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield. Then we have Soul Ring, which taps for 2 colorless mana, and Mind Stone, which taps for 1 colorless mana. The cool thing about Mind Stone is you can pay 1 and tap it, and you can also draw a card off of it as well. Then we have 2 Talismans in the deck. They both tap for a generic mana, or you can tap it for colored mana, and it deals 1 damage to you. Felwar Stone taps for 1 mana of any color that a land an opponent controls could produce. Then we have all 3 of the signets that we can run in this deck. We have Izzet, Boros, and Azorius Signet. You can pay 1 and tap them and add 2 different colors of mana to your mana pool, so this will work as ramp in your deck. Next up, we have Commander Sphere. It taps to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool in your commander's color identity. You can also sacrifice this late in the game to draw a card if you don't really need that ramp anymore. And then Generator Servant serves as ramp as well. You can tap it and sacrifice it and add 2 colorless to your mana pool. And if that mana is spent on a creature spell, it gains haste until end of turn. So this actually has 2 purposes in the deck. We do want to get Narset down quickly, and also we want to make sure that Narset has haste if possible, so it can come down and swing on the first turn it comes out. Next up, let's talk about some of the card draw that we have in the deck. And the first couple of cards are more on the card selection side than actual card draw. So first up, we have Brainstorm. It's an instant that lets you draw 3 cards and put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library. This is great because you can put a extra turn spell or an extra combat spell that you had in your hand on top of your library, and then you can attack with Narset and be able to cast that spell for free. Then we have Ponder. It lets you look at the top 3 cards of your library, put them back in any order, and then shuffle your library. Then you draw a card. Preordain lets us scry 2 and then draw a card as well. Next up, we have Opt. It's an instant, lets us scry 1 and then draw a card. And then we have Frantic Search. It's an instant, draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards, untap up to 3 lands. And then we have a wheel in this deck. We do have Windfall. It's a sorcery, and it lets each player discard their hand, then draw cards equal to the greatest number of cards a player discarded this way. Next up, we have Factor Fiction. It's an instant. You can reveal the top 5 cards of your library. An opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. You put 1 pile into your hand, the other pile into your graveyard. And then Treasure Cruise is a sorcery with Delve. Each card you exile in your graveyard while casting the spell pays for 1, and then you can draw 3 cards. Card draw is important in this deck. We do want to be able to refill our hand, especially to get some interactive spells in our hand. That way we're able to protect our extra turn spells and our extra combat spells when we play them. Next up, we're going to talk about the interaction that we have in this deck. Since we are playing a Voltron strategy in that we want to get our Narset down as quickly as possible and be able to chain off extra turn spells and extra combat spells, in this deck, the first 3 to 5 turns are critical for getting down ramp and then getting our Narset out. Until we get our Narset out, our deck really isn't doing a whole lot. So the one way that we can protect ourselves from losing the game in those first 3 to 5 turns is by putting in a lot of interaction. So we do have 11 counter spells in this deck, as well as single targeted removal and also board wipes as well. So first I'm going to go over the counter spells that we include in this deck. So first up we have Dispel. It's an instant to counter target instant spell. This is a great spell to have if you are trying to win a counter spell war. It only costs 1 mana and it's very efficient. Counter spell is an instant to counter any spell, and then Negate is an instant to counter target non-creature spell. Mana Leak is an instant and it counters target spell unless its controller pays 3. And then Arcane Denial is an instant counter target spell. Its controller may draw up to 2 cards at the beginning of next turn's upkeep. You draw a card at the beginning of next turn's upkeep. Arcane Denial is not my favorite counter spell. Giving your opponents 2 cards is quite a bit of a downside, but at least you do get 1 card off of it as well, so it replaces itself. And then we have Is It Charm. It's an instant and you can choose one. Counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2. Is It Charm deals 2 damage to target creature, or draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards. Now this is a counter spell, but it is also a modal card, and I love having modal cards in my decks because it gives you a lot of flexibility, and you can use this as a counter spell, you can use it to get rid of a problematic creature, or you can just draw 2 cards if you don't need this spell in your hand. Then we have Dovin's Veto. It's one of the newer counter spells, and it's very powerful. It's an instant, and it can't be countered. Counter target non-creature spell. Narset's Reversal, also a newer counterspell, is an instant that you can copy target instant or sorcery spell, then return it to its owner's hand. You may choose new targets for the copy. It's really important with this card is you can use it on your own spells as well. So if you do go to play a extra turn spell or an extra combat, you can cast Narset's Reversal along with it to return that extra combat or extra turn spell back to your hand, so you'll get another use of it, which is really great, especially in this deck. And then we have Counterflux. It's an instant and it can't be countered by spells or abilities, and it says counter target spell you don't control. It also has Overload as well, and you can pay 1 blue and a red. You may cast this spell for its Overload cost. If you do, change its text by replacing all instances of target with each. So this will counter all spells on the stack if you pay it for its Overload cost. Next up we have Unwind. It's an instant and you can counter target non-creature spell and untap up to 3 lands with it. Insidious Will is another modal card. It's an instant and you can choose one. Counter target spell, you may choose new targets for target spell, or copy target instant or sorcery spell, you may choose new targets for the copy. While this does cost quite a bit at 4 mana, the extra flexibility makes up for it, especially if you can copy an extra turn spell or an extra combat spell with this card. It really is a great card. Then we have some single targeted removal. So we have Rapid Hybridization. It's an instant to destroy target creature. It can't be regenerated. That creature's controller puts a 3/3 green frog lizard creature token onto the battlefield. Swords to Plowshares is an instant. Exile target creature. Its controller gains life equal to its power. And then Reality Shift is another instant. Exile target creature. Its controller manifests the top card of their library. Then we have Wear and Tear. Wear is destroy target artifact and Tear is destroy target enchantment. Generous Gift is another great card. It's an instant that lets you destroy any target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token. And then we have 3 board wipes in this deck. We have Cleansing Nova. It's a sorcery and you can choose one. Destroy all creatures or destroy all artifacts and enchantments. I love that this is a modal card, so you can choose which is best in your situation. Divine Reckoning is a sorcery. Each player chooses a creature they control and then destroy the rest. And this does have flashback. You can pay 5 white and you can cast a card from your graveyard for its flashback cost, and then exile it. Single Combat is a sorcery. Each player chooses a creature or planeswalker they control, then sacrifices the rest. Players can't cast creature or planeswalker spells until the end of your next turn. Both of these cards are really great because they keep your Narset on the battlefield. If your opponents have a big board presence and you want to wipe the board away, you can do so with ease because you'll still have your Narset on the battlefield, so you won't be set back as much as they will, especially since we don't have very many creatures in this deck anyway. Next up, let's talk about some of the ways that we're able to give Narset haste. We do want Narset to come down with Haste if possible in order to start swinging right away. We don't want to pass the turn with Narset on the battlefield. Even though she does have hexproof, if your opponents wipe the board, it's going to set you back quite a bit. You do want to get that first swing in so that you can get an extra combat or an extra turn spell and keep the chain going. So first up we have Swiftfoot Boots. It's an artifact equipment, and equipped creature has hexproof and haste, and you can equip it for 1. Need for Speed is an enchantment that you can sacrifice a land. Target creature gains haste until end of turn. And then we have Ashling's Prerogative. It's also an enchantment, and as it comes into play, choose odd or even. Each creature with converted mana cost of the chosen value has haste. Each creature without converted mana cost of the chosen value comes into play tapped. One thing to note with this card, it will give your opponent's creatures haste as well, so you do need to use caution with this card if you're playing against certain commander decks. It also does come with a way to slow down your opponents as well. If they play the opposite converted mana cost, they will come in tapped, which is nice as well. And then we have Fervor. It's an enchantment and just says creatures you control have haste. Next up, we're going to go over the spells that enable us to take extra turns or take extra combats. And this is what's going to really get the deck going. So once we get Narset down on the battlefield and we start attacking with her, we're able to play the top 4 cards off of our library for free if they're non-creature spells. And ideally, we would want an extra turn or an extra combat spell so we can keep that chain going and essentially storming off with Narset and taking extra turns and getting in with some combat damage. And we'll go over the ways that we're able to win with Narset here later in the video as well. So first up we have Part the Water Veil. It's a sorcery and it says take an extra turn after this one and then exile Part the Water Veil. And then we have Karn's Temporal Sundering. It's a legendary sorcery, so you can only cast this if you control a legendary creature or planeswalker. Target player takes an extra turn after this one, return up to 1 target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, and then exile Karn's Temporal Sundering. Beacon of Tomorrows is a sorcery that says target player takes an extra turn after this one, and then you shuffle it back into your library. Then we have Temporal Trespass. It's a sorcery with Delve. Take an extra turn after this one, and then exile Temporal Trespass. And then last but not least, for the extra turn spells, we have Stitch in Time. It's a sorcery, flip a coin. If you win the flip, take an extra turn after this one. And then for the extra combat spells, we have 5 spells, and the first one is Relentless Assault. It's a sorcery. Untap all creatures that attack this turn. After this main phase, there's an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. And then Seize the Day is a sorcery. Untap target creature. After this main phase, there's an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. The cool thing about this card is it actually has flashback as well. And then we have Savage Beating. It's an instant, and you can only play it during your turn and only during combat. Choose one. Creatures you control gain double strike until end of turn, or untap all creatures you control, and after this phase, there's an additional combat phase. You can also play this for its entwine cost as well. You get both parts of the card. Then we have World at War. It's a sorcery. After the first post-combat main phase this turn, there's an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. At the beginning of that combat, untap all creatures that attack this turn. The really nice part about this card is it actually has rebound as well. If you cast it from your hand, exile it as it resolves. At the beginning of your next upkeep, you may cast this card from exile without paying its mana cost. There are going to be times where you don't flip this off the top and you have to hard cast these spells, and having rebound's really nice because you'll get it a second time. Then we have Fury of the Horde. It's a sorcery. You may exile 2 red cards from your hand rather than pay Fury of the Horde's mana cost. Untap all creatures that attack this turn. After this main phase, there's an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. Again, you will have to play some of these spells from your hand, and being able to exile 2 red cards instead of paying the mana cost of 7 is actually really nice in this deck. So next up we have a couple of ways that we're able to get extra copies of our extra turn spells or extra combat spells. And this is important because we can only afford so many extra turn spells in our deck because of budget restrictions. So we do want some ways to get extra copies of those. So first up we have Reverberate. It's an instant to copy target instant or sorcery spell, and you may choose new targets for the copy. And then we have Increasing Vengeance. It's an instant. Copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. If this spell was cast from a graveyard, copy that spell twice instead. You may choose new targets for the copy, and this also has flashback for 5 mana. These are great if you have them in your hand or if you flip them off the top of your library in conjunction with an extra turn spell or an extra combat spell. You can get an additional copy of that spell with these, and these are really great, especially for the cost in the deck. Next up, let's talk about a couple of cards that provide us some utility in this deck. So first up, we have Narset, Parter of Veils. It's a legendary planeswalker. Each opponent can't draw more than one card each turn, and then you can -2, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this is really great if you have a bunch of wheels in your deck. If you don't, this still slows your opponents down. If they're able to get something down like Mystic Confluence or Rhystic Study, this is going to really prevent them from drawing a bunch of extra cards throughout the game. So this is a very powerful card on its own. This is going to help you find some of your interaction that you really need to slow down the game, especially early on. It will help you also find your extra turn spells and your extra combat spells and put those into your hand too. So this is a very powerful card. It does combo well with Windfall, which we do have in the deck, but that's not really the main purpose. If you get it, that's great, but it's not really what we're going for. Next up, we have Strionic Resonator. It's an artifact that you can pay 2 and tap it to copy target triggered ability you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. This is really great with Narset. If you attack with Narset and Narset puts the trigger on the stack to exile the top 4 cards of your library, you can use Strionic Resonator to copy that trigger, and then you'll put the top 8 cards of your library into exile, and you'll be able to play those top 8 cards as long as they're non-creature spells. This is a very cheap card, and it will really help you accelerate and really get the ball rolling with Narset if you get it onto the battlefield with her. Next up, we have a tutor and its long-term plans. It's an instant, and you can search your library for a card, shuffle your library, then put that card third from the top. This, with Narset on the battlefield, will get you any card to be able to play for free. And there's a couple of cards that we're going to talk about here in just a second that will be win cons that you can put there that will potentially win you the game when you cast this spell. Next up, we have Aminatu's Augury. It's a sorcery. Exile the top 8 cards of your library. You may put a land card from among them onto the battlefield. Until end of turn, for each non-land card type, you may cast a card of that type from among the exiled cards without paying its mana cost. This is basically Narset on a card. It's going to exile a bunch of cards, and then you'll be able to cast those cards for free. If you find an extra turn spell, an extra combat spell, you're able to continue to get the ball rolling with Narset. Next up, I want to talk about some of the ways that we're able to win the game with this deck. With Narset being able to cast non-creature spells off the top of our library for free, it does set you up to have some very powerful effects in your deck that can potentially win you the game. Now, since we are on a budget, we don't have the best of the best in something like Enter the Infinite or Omniscience, which will win you the game pretty much right on the spot. But we do have some ways that we're able to win at a budget on this deck. So the first card that's going to really help us close out the game is Armageddon. It's a sorcery, and it just says destroy all lands. Now, I realize this is a very mean card to play, but in Narset, it's absolutely fantastic. If you get this off the top 4 cards of your library very early in the game, it's going to set your opponents back so far that you'll be able to win the game really quickly. It's not going to be a long drawn out win if you play this, like you may see sometimes when other people play this card. Next up, we have one of my favorite cards in the deck. It's Stormherd. It's a sorcery. Create X 1/1 white Pegasus creature tokens with flying, where X is your life total. This is going to put a lot of power on the board, and it's going to help you close out the game very quickly with Narset. If you have this with an extra turn spell that you flip off the top, you're going to more often than not be able to take that extra turn and then kill an opponent with all your Pegasus creatures. Next up, we have Approach of the Second Sun. It's a sorcery. If Approach of the Second Sun was cast from your hand and you've cast another spell named Approach of the Second Sun this game, you win the game. Otherwise, put Approach of the Second Sun into its owner's library, 7th from the top, and you gain 7 life. If you're able to cast this card off the top of your library with Narset and 2 extra turn spells or extra combats, you're going to be able to win the game because you'll cast Approach of the Second Sun, it'll put it 7th from the top, you'll be able to swing with Narset twice and cast it again and then win. So this is a very powerful and easy way to win the game with Narset. There are a couple of cards in our deck that are going to help us copy our very powerful spells that we're able to play with Narset. And the first one is Swarm Intelligence. It's an enchantment. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you may copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. So if you play an extra turn spell with this, you're going to get 2 extra turns. If you play an extra combat, you'll get 2 extra combat spells as well. And then we have Thousand Year Storm. It's an enchantment. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, copy it for each other instant and sorcery spell you've cast before at this turn. You may choose new targets for the copies. Again, this is another way of getting some extra turn spells and making additional copies of those spells. And then the last way that we're able to win the game is with storm cards. So first up, we have Mind's Desire. Shuffle your library, then exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card without paying its mana cost. if you're going off with Narset and you pull this off the top, if you cast 4 or 5 cards before you play that Mind's Desire, you're going to get 5 cards off the top of your library that you're going to be able to play for free, which is really powerful. And then we have Empty the Warrens. It's a sorcery. Create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, and this has Storm as well. So again, if you're able to storm off a little bit with Narset and get a bunch of extra combats and maybe a Strionic Resonator, or you have your 2 enchantments that give you extra copies of spells, you're going to be able to create quite a few goblins with Empty the Warrens and help close out the game through combat damage with Narset. Thank you so much for watching this Budget Deck Tech today. If you have any suggestions for some of the picks in this deck, or agree with or disagree with some of the choices, let us know in the comments down below. If you like this video, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel if you haven't already, and check us out on Patreon over at patreon.com/BudgetEDH. There's a lot of different tiers for rewards over on Patreon. See you guys next time.